In our previous journeys, we followed gold through imprisonment, weathering, transport, and preservation. We watched nuggets negotiate with gravity, settle into overlooked landscapes, and survive environments that eventually became comfortable enough for them to stop moving altogether. We learned that gold rarely announces itself. It rarely sits under a spotlight. It rarely rewards impatience. It prefers becoming invisible. It prefers waiting. It prefers remaining exactly where people stop paying attention. But eventually experienced prospectors discover something even more surprising. They stop depending entirely on equipment. They begin borrowing tools built by nature itself. Not detectors, not pans, not dredges, not sluices. Tools engineered millions of years before humans ever searched for treasure. And perhaps the strangest part is that most people walk directly across these tools every single day without ever recognizing them. Because nature's prospecting tools don't resemble prospecting tools. They resemble damaged hillsides, broken ridges, dead roots, collapsed pockets, ordinary fractures, animal disturbances, weathered scars, even uncomfortable patches of ground that people simply avoid because they appear uninteresting. And perhaps the biggest mistake prospectors make isn't failing to find gold. Perhaps the biggest mistake is standing directly above nature's own prospecting system while searching somewhere else. The first natural tool professionals quietly borrow is something I like to call gravity's forgotten warehouse. Gravity enjoys movement. It enjoys transporting sediment. It enjoys carrying particles downhill. But gravity also becomes lazy. Eventually, gravity encounters obstacles. Energy decreases, transport slows, and suddenly, certain materials begin negotiating for permanence. Gold understands this remarkably well. Gold dislikes unnecessary travel. It prefers becoming comfortable. Imagine a mountainside surviving thousands of years of weathering. Rain removes clay. Wind removes dust. Organic material accumulates. Weak minerals disappear. Tiny channels reorganize sediment. Season after season. Year after year. Century after century. Eventually, a peculiar environment develops. Not a creek, not a river, not a gravel bar. An ordinary-looking slope. Nothing impressive. No visible nuggets. No spectacular quartz veins. Nothing Instagram-worthy. Yet beneath your boots, the hillside has quietly become a warehouse. A warehouse storing survivors, heavy survivors, persistent survivors. Materials stubborn enough to negotiate with gravity. Gold occasionally survives. Garnet survive. Corundum survives. Tourmaline survives. Dense fragments survive. And professionals eventually stop asking, where is the gold? Instead, they ask, where would gravity become tired? That question changes everything, because prospectors spend years chasing exposed nuggets. Professionals occasionally spend years studying exhausted landscapes. They study hillsides that appear disappointing. They study ridges every one abandoned. They study weathering compartments. Because weathering itself occasionally becomes a second natural tool. Weathering is often misunderstood. People imagine destruction. Professionals imagine selection. Weathering doesn't simply destroy. Weathering evaluates. It removes weak participants. It preserves stubborn participants. It reorganizes landscapes. It engineers storage systems. Imagine weathering acting like an ancient sorting machine, millions of years old, operating continuously, never requiring maintenance, never requiring electricity, never stopping. Material enters. Material exits. Weak minerals disappear. Fragile structures collapse. Gold survives. Dense crystals survive. Heavy particles survive. Eventually, nature leaves behind a conversation between time and resistance. Professionals quietly listen to that conversation, and perhaps that's where the second natural tool begins appearing. Nature occasionally builds concentration devices. People simply don't recognize them. Imagine standing beneath an old tree. Nothing unusual. No visible mineralization. No prospectors nearby. No detectors, no pans, no excitement, just roots. Old roots, twisting roots, expanding roots. Professionals occasionally stop there, because roots are surprisingly ambitious engineers. Roots penetrate fractures, roots exploit weakness, roots expand, roots lift rock fragments, roots trap sediment, roots create barriers, tiny barriers, invisible barriers, but barriers capable of influencing movement. Heavy particles moving downslope occasionally encounter roots. Transport decreases. Sediment accumulates. Fine material settles. Dense survivors occasionally remain behind. And professionals slowly realize something remarkable. Nature occasionally builds riffles, not wooden riffles, not aluminum riffles, biological riffles, root riffles, and perhaps that sounds strange, until you remember our previous journeys. Gold negotiates. Gold prefers becoming comfortable. Gold enjoys environments where movement becomes expensive. Roots occasionally create exactly that environment, and then another natural tool appears. Animals. People laugh when animals are discussed in prospecting. Professionals rarely laugh. Animals excavate continuously. Rodents excavate. Ants excavate. Termites excavate. Badgers excavate. Foxes excavate. Burrowing animals sample geological systems every day, without salaries, without geology degrees, without exploration budgets. Millions of tiny excavators, operating continuously, exposing fresh material, bringing fragments upward, moving sediment, reorganizing slopes. Professionals occasionally inspect animal disturbances, not because animals find gold, because animals expose conversations hidden beneath the soil. A fragment appears. Heavy minerals appear. Fresh material appears. Clues appear. And slowly the viewer begins realizing something. Nature already prospects. Nature already samples. Nature already sorts. Nature already concentrates. Nature already exposes. Professionals simply learn how to borrow these ancient tools. And perhaps the most surprising realization of all isn't that these tools exist. Perhaps it's realizing how many people spend thousands of dollars upgrading equipment. While quietly stepping across prospecting systems, nature has been refining for millions of years. Most prospectors believe bedrock is simply the floor beneath a stream. Professionals rarely think of it that way. To them, bedrock is a record. Every fracture, polished surface, resistant rib, weathered pocket, and exposed contact tells a story that water has been writing for thousands, sometimes millions of years. And perhaps the biggest mistake beginners make is assuming that gold is controlled by the stream. In reality, the stream is often following instructions written by the bedrock itself. That sounds unusual at first. After all, water appears to choose its own direction. But if you study enough productive drainages, another pattern quietly begins to emerge. Water is surprisingly obedient. It follows weakness. It follows ancient fractures. It follows faults. It follows joints. It follows lithological boundaries where one rock gradually surrendered faster than another. Long before a creek appeared on a map, those weaknesses already existed. The landscape simply waited for water to discover them. And once water did, something remarkable happened. The same structural pathways that once guided mineral-rich fluids deep underground eventually began guiding rivers across the surface. Two completely different systems, separated by millions of years, yet connected by exactly the same geological architecture. That realization changes the way professionals approach a creek. They don't begin by looking into the water. They begin by looking beneath it. Imagine a broad section of exposed bedrock. To most people, it looks smooth, almost featureless. To an experienced field geologist, it resembles an aerial map of traffic lanes. Some lanes carried hydrothermal fluids hundreds of millions of years ago. Others simply became zones where erosion advanced more rapidly. Some fractures widened, others remained sealed. Some became natural traps, others became escape routes. And over immense periods of time, flowing water inherited those ancient pathways. This is why productive bedrock is rarely random. Gold doesn't simply settle on any exposed rock surface. It searches for interruptions, tiny steps, pressure shadows, fracture intersections, shallow grooves, natural expansion joints. These features may appear insignificant, yet they perform one remarkable task. They reduce energy. The moment water loses just a little of its carrying power, the heaviest particles begin negotiating with gravity. And once again, we arrive at a principle we've encountered throughout our previous journeys. Gold almost never wins by moving faster. Gold wins by surviving longer. A pebble can continue downstream. Sand may travel another 100 yards. Clay may remain suspended for miles. Gold rarely has that luxury. Its density forces difficult decisions. Every flood becomes a negotiation. Every current becomes a test. Every obstacle becomes an opportunity. Professionals understand this instinctively. That is why they spend surprisingly little time looking for yellow reflections. Instead, they search for places where movement itself became impossible. A narrow fracture crossing the stream at an angle. A shallow depression protected behind a resistant rib of bedrock. An old pothole carved by swirling water centuries ago. A contact where one rock weathered more rapidly than the neighboring unit, creating a natural shelf. These are not merely interesting geological features. They are conversations between flowing water and solid rock. And gold quietly listens to everyone. Perhaps the most fascinating discovery is that productive bedrock almost never reveals its importance from a single clue. Professionals rarely trust one signal. Instead, they wait for several independent observations to agree. A fracture intersects a resistant ridge. The ridge creates a low-pressure pocket. The pocket contains dense black sands. The surrounding bedrock displays polished surfaces indicating repeated high-energy flow. Suddenly, 4 independent clues are pointing toward exactly the same conclusion. That is no longer coincidence. That is geological agreement. And geological agreement is often far more valuable than luck. This explains why 2 people can search the same creek on the same day and leave with completely different results. One follows the water, the other follows the bedrock. One searches visible gravel, the other studies invisible architecture. One is searching for gold, the other is searching for the places where nature quietly decided gold should stop moving. That difference may seem subtle. In reality, it separates observation from interpretation. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson bedrock has to teach. It doesn't point directly at treasure. It teaches you how to think like the landscape itself. Because every productive stream is only the latest chapter in a story that began long before the first drop of water ever flowed across its surface. The river is temporary. The gravel is temporary. Even the valley is temporary. But the structural memory preserved inside the bedrock has remained for millions of years, patiently influencing every flood, every season, and every grain of sediment that has passed overhead. And perhaps that is why experienced prospectors spend so much time looking down at ordinary rock, while everyone else is watching the current. They understand something that only geology can teach. The stream may carry the gold, but the bedrock decides where its journey ends. We discovered that rock patterns quietly preserve ancient mineral pathways, that bedrock remembers geological events long after mountains have changed, and that gravity patiently builds natural storage places where heavy materials finally stop moving. But today, we are standing beside something that most prospectors completely misunderstand. A river bend. Thousands of people walk past bends like this every year. They look at the water, they look at the gravel. Some begin panning immediately. Others swing a detector for a few minutes before moving on. Experienced prospectors often do something completely different. They stop, not because they have already seen gold, but because they have just seen a question. And professional prospectors know something beginners rarely realize. The right question is often worth more than the right equipment. Now imagine standing beside two rivers. Both appear almost identical. Both have clean gravel. Both have exposed bedrock. Both have attractive bends. Both have been flowing for thousands of years. Most people would believe they have the same chance of containing gold. They don't. In fact, one of them may never produce a worthwhile concentration, while the other quietly collects heavy materials every single flood season. Why? The answer has almost nothing to do with the water itself. It begins beneath your feet. Before a single drop of water entered this valley, before the first tree grew along these banks, and before animals ever crossed this landscape, the bedrock had already decided where future rivers would prefer to flow. That surprises many people. We often imagine rivers carving landscapes entirely on their own. Reality is considerably more interesting. Rivers negotiate. Bedrock negotiates harder. Every river follows weakness, ancient fractures, old fault zones, weathered contacts, soft lithological boundaries, natural corridors created millions of years earlier. In other words, a river is often reading a geological map that nobody can see. And the moment you understand that idea, every bend suddenly becomes much more than a curve in flowing water. It becomes a geological decision. Now here's where most prospectors make their first expensive mistake. They assume every inside bend is automatically productive. That idea has been repeated for decades. Sometimes it's correct. Sometimes it costs people years of wasted effort. Because rivers do not deposit gold simply because they turn. They deposit gold because energy changes. Those are two completely different things. Some bends create only a gentle reduction in flow. Others force water into violent turbulence that keeps even heavy particles moving. Some bends hide solid bedrock shells beneath the sediment. Others rest on deep layers of loose gravel that never allow gold to stabilize. To the eye, they look almost identical. To the river, they behave like completely different worlds. Professionals learn to recognize that difference before they unpack a single tool. They don't begin by asking where the bend is. They begin by asking what the river is feeling. Is the current accelerating? Is it collapsing? Is pressure increasing? Is it suddenly expanding into open space? Every answer changes the story. Imagine pouring hundreds of steel ball bearings across a smooth floor. Now place a small wooden block in their path. The moment the bearings strike that obstacle, their movement changes. Some bounce, some slow, some collect behind the obstacle. Water behaves similarly, except instead of steel bearings, the river is transporting billions of particles of different sizes and different weights. Clay behaves one way. Fine sand behaves another. Quartz gravel behaves differently again. Gold behaves unlike almost everything else. Gold doesn't enjoy sudden acceleration. Gold negotiates constantly with gravity. Every flood becomes an argument. The river says, keep moving. Gravity replies, stay here. Eventually, one of them wins. The places where gravity begins winning are the places professionals become interested in. Notice something fascinating. Gold rarely chooses its own resting place. The landscape chooses it. That is one of the biggest differences between recreational prospecting and professional observation. Beginners chase visible gold. Professionals chase the places where the landscape quietly forces gold to surrender. Now another clue appears. Look beyond the bend itself. Most viewers never do. Instead, study the valley. Is it narrow upstream? Does it suddenly widen? Has the river just exited a rocky gorge? Did it encounter resistant bedrock before entering the bend? These questions matter because rivers remember what happened only a few hundred feet earlier. A river leaving a confined channel often experiences a dramatic reduction in energy. That reduction can completely change how heavy materials behave. Gold that remained mobile through the narrow section suddenly encounters a different environment. The river relaxes. Velocity decreases. Transport becomes more selective. Heavy particles begin making decisions. And perhaps nowhere is that decision more important than where bedrock quietly interrupts the process. If you could remove every grain of sand from a productive bend, you would discover something remarkable. The bedrock rarely appears smooth. Instead, it resembles a landscape of its own, Tiny ridges, natural gutters, cross-cutting fractures, expansion joints, weathered pockets, pressure shadows, shallow basins carved by centuries of turbulent flow. To most people, these are random imperfections. Professionals recognize them as hydraulic architecture. Every one of those tiny structures influences moving water. Every one changes pressure. Every one changes velocity. Every one influences where dense particles finally become comfortable enough to stop moving. And perhaps that is the most surprising discovery of all. Gold isn't simply trapped. Gold is negotiated into place. The river spends years trying to move it. Gravity spends years trying to stop it. Bedrock quietly acts as the referee, and every flood writes another chapter in that endless negotiation. And perhaps that is exactly why experienced prospectors rarely become excited when they first see a beautiful bend. Instead, they begin searching for something most people never notice. Interruptions. Nature dislikes smooth transitions. Water certainly doesn't. Imagine the current racing around a bend after heavy rainfall. At first, everything appears chaotic. Foam, gravel, branches, suspended sediment. The entire river seems alive. Yet, beneath that apparent chaos, something remarkably organized is happening. Water is making thousands of tiny decisions every second. Every boulder changes direction. Every exposed rib of bedrock creates turbulence. Every fracture redirects pressure. Every shallow rise steals a little energy. Most particles never notice. Gold does, because gold cannot afford mistakes. Quartz pebbles may continue another 50 yards. Fine gravel may continue another 100. Sand may remain suspended long after the flood subsides. Gold rarely enjoys those opportunities. Its density forces immediate negotiation, and perhaps nowhere does that negotiation become more interesting than where two completely different currents suddenly meet. Most people imagine rivers flowing in one direction. Professionals know better. Inside productive bends, water often behaves like several rivers occupying the same channel simultaneously. One current accelerates, another slows. One dives downward, another rises. Tiny rotating cells begin forming beneath the surface, invisible rivers inside the river, and those invisible currents quietly determine where heavy materials become prisoners. Now imagine a submerged rib of bedrock extending only a few inches above the surrounding surface. Most people never know it exists. The water certainly does. As the current strikes that ridge, pressure suddenly increases. Water climbs over it, then immediately collapses behind it. A tiny low-pressure pocket forms. To a floating leaf, nothing important has happened. To a gold particle weighing several times more than surrounding sediment, everything has changed. Movement becomes expensive. Gravity finally gains an advantage. The particle settles, perhaps permanently. This is why professionals rarely become fascinated by what they can see. They become fascinated by what they cannot. Hidden architecture, invisible hydraulics, ancient structures quietly controlling modern rivers. And then another clue quietly appears. Look carefully at the size of the gravel, not the color, not the quantity, the size. If a bend contains a strange mixture of very coarse cobbles resting beside unexpectedly fine sediment, professionals immediately begin asking questions. Because rivers prefer organization. Similar energies transport similar materials. When dramatically different particle sizes begin sharing the same small area, something interrupted the normal sorting process. That interruption matters. Perhaps bedrock suddenly rises beneath the gravel. Perhaps an old fracture diverted flow. Perhaps a resistant ledge forced turbulence downward. Perhaps an ancient flood rearranged the entire channel. Whatever the reason, normal transportation failed. And whenever transportation fails, heavy materials become interested, gold included. Now another discovery. Many prospectors spend their entire lives watching the water. Experienced observers occasionally spend more time watching the bank. That sounds backwards, until you understand why. Riverbanks preserve memory. Fresh erosion exposes history. Every collapsed section reveals another chapter of the valley's evolution. Old flood layers, ancient gravel bars, compact clay horizons, oxidized sediments, buried cobbles, sometimes even abandoned channels. Professionals don't simply see dirt, they see timelines, and occasionally those timelines reveal something extraordinary. A river that occupies today's channel may have flowed somewhere completely different thousands of years ago. Today's productive bend may not have been productive then. Yesterday's richest channel may now lie hidden beneath forest soil 50 yards away. Suddenly, the viewer realizes something remarkable. Prospecting isn't only about reading the present, it's about reading landscapes that no longer exist. That realization changes everything. Because the richest gold doesn't always belong to the modern river. Sometimes it belongs to the ancient one. And perhaps that is why experienced prospectors occasionally leave an active creek and begin walking into the trees. Not because they've given up. Because they've just followed the river's forgotten memory instead of its visible water. And perhaps that's one of the greatest differences between searching and understanding. Because rivers change, floods change, gravel changes, even valleys change. But the geological conversation between bedrock, gravity, and flowing water has been repeating itself for millions of years. The professionals who consistently recover gold are rarely chasing luck. They're simply learning to recognize the same ancient conversation wherever they find it.